To work on setting up our document for a book or a magazine in InDesign. We have a nice welcome screen right here. You can go right to new file, or you can go file, new document. And it will open up a panel for us that has some default settings that you can go into, kind of streamline what you're setting up for print or web or mobile. But you don't have to. You can also work over here, which is where we are going to work. First thing I'm going to do is change this to inches because I prefer to work in inches right now. What is the size of your document? I'm going to just work in standard 8.5 by 11 for this tutorial. And this is the size of my page. So if my book or my magazine is closed, this is what the one page would look like, not the spread. So 8.5 by 11 is fine. But this is a book, so I do want to have it in spreads, and that's what facing pages is. And it is default checked, but for some reason it's not. Make sure you are checking facing pages. That means when we look at our document, when we open this, we're going to see two 8.5 by 11 pages next to each other, and that is our spread. And that's how we're going to view our book when we open it, or our magazine when we open it. And so we want to design that way so we can see what the person's going to see. You don't have to set up pages in here if you don't want to. I'll just go ahead and start with 10, and we can add or take away as many as we want when we get into our document. So if you want to set up a certain amount, go ahead. You are able to set up columns and your column gutters right in here, but we're not going to right now because we are going to do another tutorial that talks about grids. So we'll leave that alone. We are going to set up our margins and our bleed, and I'll explain slug. So for margins, that is, I like to work in kind of a general rule. Margins for me are do not go past this point. So it is a place I establish as my endpoint in my document so that no matter what, I know that anything important has to stay in these margins. Within that, I'll set up my own grid, but I like to have these external edges here that allow me to know that do not pass go. 0.5 is pretty big, which is great. I'm a big fan of that. And you might want to decide that you have them unequal for different reasons. For example, the bottom, I am going to set up an unequal amount because I am going to need to have some extra room for my page numbers and extra information. You might decide that's at the top, the outside, or the bottom in your book or magazine. I'm going to choose bottom. It's a pretty standard place. Everything else, 0.5 is wonderful. The bleed, this is the line you set up so that anything that you want to go right to the edge of your document, like a full bleed image, is going to actually go right to the edge. Because when you send your document to print, it might cut slightly in or slightly out. So if you have a bleed line and you put your image to the bleed line, you won't have to worry about that. And I'll show you that when we open up our document. For now, we're going to set it up the standard 0.125 inches. If you are working with a print vendor for your book or magazine that requires something different, you do what they say because that's set up to their print specifications. Standard 125 is fine. I typed it into top, but I want it on all the rest of them. This little chain here is attached, so all I have to do is click in here and it'll apply to all of them. If I didn't want that, like up here, these are set up differently. You can see I put that 0.75 inch for my bottom margin, but I wanted 0.5 everywhere else, and it changed on me because this is attached, or this is, the chain was attached. So I'm going to go back in, I'm actually going to attach it, and go to 0.5 for all of them, unattach it, and then set up my 0.75 in the bottom. Now when I click in other spots, it's going to stay because this is not linked. This is linked. They're all the same. That's good for me. We're not going to do anything with the slug. I'm not sure many people do. It was set up as a place in your document to hold added information, so I could dedicate, say, an inch at the bottom, and that is not something that would print in my document. It would be there for holding information about the document. For example, how many revisions has this gone through? I never used it because the organization I worked in, we had our own separate place to put all of that information that was not in the document. So we never used it. So this is all set up now. We're going to click create so we can see it. And it will open up our document with everything we said to do. So I have my 10 pages. It's set up with facing pages. And it has everything I need for my margins and my bleed. So let's just explain a little bit about what we did now that we can see it. As you can see over here, I have page 2 and 3 are right next to each other. And this is what it looks like in my working space. But my first page and my last page is set up as single pages. And that is because in a book or in a magazine, it is going to start with a single page. This might be your cover, front cover and back cover, or it might be your title page and your final page. When you're printing a magazine or a book that's going to lay open and have 2 pages, you need to print in spreads. And it begins in a single page and ends in a single page because when it's closed, that's what it has. So in a document that is really small, like a very small magazine, like you might be doing, you could have your cover and your back cover be right in this document. If you're doing something bigger, like a book or a thick magazine, your cover is actually going to be in a separate document because it's going to be a different size. Because you don't just have front and back cover, you also have the spine, and that's going to vary in thickness depending on how many pages you have in your book or your magazine. So in this example, we're going to keep it all in one, but just know that that's kind of a funky thing that you have to work with, and that will be case by case depending on what you're designing. For the sake of this tutorial, we'll leave it as is. I just wanted to explain it. So now let's look at our grid lines that we set up. These are our basic grid lines that are just kind of setting up rules for us for the whole document. I mentioned your bleed, and I will just use a black box to show you what a full bleed image is and why we set it up the way we set it up. So I have this black box, which is representing a full bleed image, taking up the whole page. I can click W on my keyboard just to hide and show grid lines. And what it's hiding as well is this bleed over here. So if I click W, it'll show me what it looks like when I get this printed and cut. And that is lovely. We have a full bleed image. What it's not showing is what would happen if they cut this and it actually didn't cut right on this cut line right here, this 8.5 by 11 block we've dedicated as our document. What if we go in the cutter and it shifts just slightly to the side over here? What's going to actually happen when we do cut, I'm just going to kind of fudge the visual of this, is it's going to shift over and it's going to give us a white block here, which is going to look terrible because now we have what we've established to be a full bleed image and this horrible, unplanned white sliver over here. That's where the bleed comes in. If you set up your document and you have a full bleed image and you set it up to the document edge, that is not setting up a full bleed. You need to go to the bleed line. So you want to have bleed and you want to use bleed for anything print related. In some projects with your print, with your book or your magazine, or some stages, you might be working digitally and exporting digitally, and I won't be able to see your bleed. But it should always be there if it is a print document, no matter what, whether you're planning on printing it or not. That way it's always ready to go. So we have our bleed line, we have our full bleed image right out to that line on all edges, and I'm happy with that. We also have a margin in here. So say I am working with a lot of body copy, and I'm just going to set this to white so we can have an example. And I'm working with a lot of body copy, and I have my type in here. That didn't work. And I have my type in here. I want to make sure that my type isn't so close to the edge, so that way when it gets printed, it has some space around it, which is really helpful for just viewing it. We want to have some breathing room so we don't feel tension. And we want to also make sure if this were not to get cut exactly on the line and it got cut inward a little bit, it's not going to creep into this visual space we've given, in this breathing room we've given our type. So a good margin is going to allow us to have a little bit of wiggle room. So one thing I want to show now is what happens in the spread. We have this margin space in here as well. But one thing that we can't see with this spread is what it's going to look like when it's printed and bound. And what tends to happen is this gutter in here, which is where the binding is, gets kind of sucked in the middle there and we lose a little bit of it. It's either glued or sewn together and it kind of bumps out a little bit. There are some options that allow a true lay flat where the book spread is open and it's fully flat, but that's a bit more expensive to print and not as likely that you're going to do it. So what I like to do is go back into my document setup here and adjust this inside space. Now we could have set this up right at the beginning and you likely will, but I purposely didn't because I wanted to show you what it looked like where it was just all equal. So we have the top, the bottom, the outside, and the inside. And that's over here where our margins. So the top, the bottom, inside, and outside. I already set up my bottom to be 0.75 inches, so I'd have a little extra room for my page numbering. But what I didn't do is set up my inside to have a little extra space to give us that breathing room when it's bound. So I'm going to break this chain here because, oops, and double check your work because it looks like it changed my bottom here. Break the chain. Oh, it was broken. I'm sorry. That was my mistake. All right. And we're going to keep, I have to go back and fix the 0.5. We're going to keep the 0.5 on the top and the outside here. And the bottom, I want a little extra. And now the inside, I want a little extra. And I think a 0.75 is probably good, but I also really like a little bit of extra breathing room, so I'm going to set it to 1 inch, which is a lot. And the reason why this is important to do right now, where you've got no design, is because changing inside margin from a 1/2 inch to 1 inch is pretty big. And if you already have a lot of design elements in here, you're going to have to shift quite a lot in your design. So it's important to set this up as best as you think you're going to need it before you do any work. So I'll click OK, and then this has been adjusted. Now, if I find that my binding ends up eating up this amount of space in here, whoops. Sorry, I keep right-clicking by accident. Spinning ball of death. Okay. Just set it to a random color. If my binding starts eating up this spot in here for the glue or the sewing, this is now the visual space I have. It doesn't go over to this middle here. So just by giving myself an extra inside margin, I've opened up that breathing room so things aren't going to feel very tight in there. And you've probably opened up books before and that wasn't accounted for, but for the most part, we do read books that have extra margin in here. So it would be helpful to go ahead and take a peek at a book and start to look at all of these things we just set up. Look at a book or a magazine that has a full bleed image, and you'll see the image is fully bled right out to the edge. There's no white. Look at the gutter, which is in here, and see how much breathing room you have before it reaches the type. And if you want, you can really crack open that spine and try to find the real center and see if they added the extra margin space in here like we did. And you might also see that there's extra margin space at the bottom. I'm not going to go into setting that up just yet because we'll do that in a future tutorial. But this is the basic setup for a book or a magazine.